Hi guys, so we're going to start this section of the reading on page 60 of chapter 3, and says, when Sean Toohey first spotted Michael Orr. It's in the break in the page, so if you see here, here's the first section, and then right here, the break in the page, and when Sean Toohey is right there. So, let's go ahead. When Sean Toohey first spotted Michael Orr sitting in the stands in the Briarcrest gym, staring at basketball practice, he saw a boy with nowhere to go but up. The question was how to take him there. Sean was an American success story. He had come from nothing and made himself rich. He was 43 years old. His hairline had receded, but not quite to the point where you could call him bald, and his stomach had expanded, but not quite to the point where you could call him fat. He was keenly interested in social status, his own and other people's, but not in this old Southern kind. Go ahead and underline the sentence where it says, you can pause me while you do this so that you don't freak out and get lost. Underline the sentence where it says he was keenly interested in social status, his own and other people's, but not in the old Southern kind. Okay? Not long after he'd become a figure in Memphis, a rich businessman who had his own jet and was the radio voice of the Memphis Grizzlies, who I have no idea who they are. He'd had feelers from the Memphis Country Club. Coffee is important. He didn't encourage them because, as he put it, I don't hang with the blues. I'd rather go to a high school football game on Friday night than go to a country club and drink 4 scotches and complain about my wife. Underline that whole quote, I don't hang with the blues, all the way to the end of I don't complain about my wife. Right to then. Page 61. Sean Toohey loved success. He delighted in the sight of people moving up in the world. Country clubs were all about staying in one place. When he introduced himself to Big Mike, Sean was already knee-deep in the various problems and crises of the few black students at Briarcrest. Sean's daughter, Collins, a junior at Briarcrest and Tennessee state champion in the pole vault, had guaranteed him almost constant exposure to them. She ran track, they ran track. The first time Sean decided to play a role in their social education had been a couple of years earlier, when the track team traveled to Chattanooga for a meet. Coincidentally, also in Chattanooga, a Briarcrest tennis player was playing a tournament at the fancy local country club. Sean thought the black kids at Briarcrest might benefit from some exposure to tennis and golf and other white country club sports, and he thought the Briarcrest tennis player would enjoy a cheering section. Gathering up all 2 of the black kids on the track team, which amounted to 2/3 of the black kids at Briarcrest, he drove them to the Chattanooga Country Club. Sure enough, it was, for them, an entirely new experience. Neither had ever seen a tennis match in person, and while they had no idea how to keep score, they quickly worked out that the Briarcrest kid was making mincemeat of his opponent. After each point, they'd stand and holler and raise their fists. Woo, woo, woo! Rather than explain tennis club etiquette, of which he vaguely disapproved anyway, Sean let them have their fun. Between sets, they ran over to the concession stand, where little old ladies sniffed at them. I think y'all are just bad taste, to which one of the kids replied, you must be rooting for that other little white guy. The lady went off in a huff, and the kids returned to the match, where the Briarcrest player kept on winning. The breaking point came when one of the kids stood up and screamed, keep on, you beating him like a $2 whore. Sean tried to drag the boy by his oversized jersey back into his seat, but before he could get him down, the boy spotted the little old lady in the stands, glaring at him, and screamed, it's gotta be killing you, ma'am, it's gotta be killing you. Hilarious. Afterwards, Sean realized that it had been a while since he had had so much fun, and by the time he met Big Mike, he had a new unofficial title. Life guidance counselor to whatever black athlete stumbled into the Briarcrest Christian School. The black kids reminded him, in a funny way, of himself. Sean knew what it meant to be the poor kid in a private school, because he'd been one himself. First off, none of the rich kids realized that one big difference between public schools and private schools is that, in the public schools, lunch was free. Every day, for several years in high school, Sean arrived without lunch or money to buy it, and bummed what he could from friends. When food is finite, he said, you'd be surprised how much time you spend thinking about it. Underline that sentence. When food is finite, you'd be surprised how much time you spend thinking about it. He also knew what it was like to think of sports as a meal ticket. His sense that his future dependent on his athletic ability, was driven home during his freshman year in high school when his father, a legendary but ill-paid basketball coach, suffered a stroke and ceased to function. Sean had adored his father. From the age of 3, when he had grabbed a basketball and followed him to work in the morning, he had spent the better part of his life on his father's heels, soaking in everything he could about basketball and life. 25 years later, he would say, "Everything I do is still all about my daddy." And yet, when he lost his father, he and everyone around him went on about their lives as if the earth had not just opened and swallowed the most important person in his life. The fancy New Orleans private school was still, for him, free. Lunch was not. He left New Orleans for the University of Mississippi on a basketball scholarship. When he set out for Ole Miss, he was a 6'1", 147-pound exception. He wasn't even sure he could cut it as a college basketball player. When he walked off the court after his final game, he set the NCAA record for career assists, and 25 years later, he still holds all meaningful SEC assist records. After he'd led Ole Miss to its first, and still only, SEC championship in 1981, a photograph of him, perched on top of the rim and bleeding from a cut on his chin as he cut down the nets, appeared in the New York Times. At a college still trying to figure out why their white boys were being whipped so routinely by the other team's black boys, he was an instant legend. That was the joy. The misery was his essential powerlessness. He was at the mercy of a single man who specialized in tearing his players apart and leaving them in pieces. From the moment he had arrived at the Ole Miss gym, Sean realized that his coach had him trapped. He could only afford to stay in school so long as he played basketball, and he played at his coach's pleasure. Underline that sentence. From the moment he had arrived at the Ole Miss gym, Sean realized that his coach had him trapped. He could only afford to stay in school so long as he played basketball, and he played at his coach's pleasure. Underline that whole sentence. His entire identity hung in the balance. From the age of 5, I had been trained to do this one thing, play basketball. And if I couldn't do that, where did it leave me? And this coach, who had him by the short hairs, loved nothing more than to give him a yank, threatening to bench him, pull his scholarship, humiliate him in front of his hometown crowd when the Ole Miss team played in New Orleans. Early in his freshman year, for instance, the team had traveled to Bloomington Normal, Illinois, to play in a tournament. In the first game, they beat Loyola Chicago. In the finals, they got beaten badly by a nationally ranked Illinois State team. The game ended just before midnight, and they were supposed to drive 4 hours to the St. Louis airport, then catch an early morning commercial flight back to Memphis. Sean had played every minute of both games with torn cartilage in his knee, and afterwards had to be treated by trainers. When he emerged from the locker room, he found a fleet of cars and only one spot left in them, right beside his coach. No one else on the team wanted to sit next to the coach. Underline what I'm about to say. For the next 4.5 hours, he said, not one word was spoken. Not one word. I got a cramp in my leg, and I remember holding back a scream because I was afraid of getting in trouble. Finish. That's where I want you to stop underlining. That whole quote. They got their plane and returned to Memphis, where a bus picked them up and carried them the rest of the way to Oxford, Mississippi. We drove onto campus. There isn't anyone there. It's Christmas Day. It's now 11 in the morning, and we still haven't slept. Coach gets up in the front of the bus and says, dressed, stretched, and taped. 30 minutes. And I just remember going, I don't know about y'all, but I haven't slept. Still, the players all trudged to the locker room, donned practice uniforms, and set out for the film room. That's how practice always started, by watching films of their most recent performance and being humiliated by Coach. The players found their seats, and the lights went down, and Coach entered the room. He always took a wide circle on his way to the lounge chair in the back. The players felt watched. I had played 40 minutes of both games, Sean said. My knee was swelled up as big as Dallas. We hadn't slept. It's my first Christmas away from home. Coach walked around so he was right behind me and stopped. Never once in 4 years did he call me Sean. It was either Buddy or 12. Now he comes right up behind me and says, Hey 12, Merry fucking Christmas. The lights went out and I cried for the next 45 minutes. The assistant coach literally sat there rubbing my back and patting me. For 4 years, he played what he called survival ball. He had to play or he couldn't afford school. The New Jersey Nets drafted him in a late round to play in the NBA, but the desire had gone out of him. He left Ole Miss with a fiancé and a new religion, but he left without a penny. Underline, for 4 years, all the way through to he left without a penny. That whole paragraph. By the fall of 2002, He'd become, by just about every way they measured it in Memphis, a success. He'd been born again and helped to create one of the fastest growing evangelical churches in Memphis, the Grace Evangelical Church. He'd married the Ole Miss cheerleader who, 25 years later, could still pass for an Ole Miss cheerleader. He owned a chain of 85 Taco Bells, KFCs, and Long John Silver restaurants, along with a mountain of debt. His financial life remained risky. If everything broke right, he might soon be worth as much as $50 million. If everything did not break right, he could always call games for the Memphis Grizzlies. What Atlanta was to the American South, Sean Tuohy was to the Southern white male. Prosperous. Underline that sentence. We'll talk about it tomorrow in class. What Atlanta was to the American South, Sean Tuohy was to the white Southern male. Prosperous. Forever upgrading the trappings of his existence, happy to exchange his past at a deep discount for a piece of the future. It wasn't enough. The restaurants ran themselves, the Grizzlies gig was a night job, church was on Sundays. He needed overt drama in his life. He was a person for whom the clock was always running out, the game was always tied, and the ball was always in his hands. He'd played the role for long enough that he'd become the role, and he now had all the time in the world for what he still loved more than anything, hanging around school gyms and acting as a kind of consultant to the coaches at Briarcrest in their dealings with their players. Sean was interested in poor jocks in the same way that a former diva might be interested in opera singers or a Jesuit scholar in debaters. What he liked about them was that he knew how to help them. What I learned playing basketball at Ole Miss, he said, was what not to do. Beat up a kid. It's easy to beat up a kid. The hard thing is to build him up. Underline that sentence, that whole quote. What I learned playing at Ole Miss. Okay, that whole quote to the end of the hard thing is to build him up. Collins had mentioned Big Mike to him. When she tried to pass him in the stairwell, she said she had to back up to the top because she couldn't fit past him. Without uttering a peep, the kid had become the talk of the school. Everyone was frightened of him, she said, until they realized he was far more terrified of them. Sean had seen Big Mike around the halls 3 or 4 times. He noticed that he wore the same clothes every day, cut-off blue jeans and an oversized t-shirt. Now he saw him in the stands and thought, I'll bet he's hungry. Sean walked over and said, You don't know me, but we have more in common than you might think. Underline that. Now he saw him in the stands and thought, I'll bet he's hungry, all the way to more in common than you might think. The end of the quote. Going on. Michael Orr stared intently at his feet. What did you eat for lunch today? Sean said. In the cafeteria, said the kid. I didn't ask you where you ate, said Sean. I asked what you ate. Had a few things, said the kid. Sure you did, thought Sean. He asked if he needed money for lunch, and Mike said, I don't need any money. The next day, Sean went to Briarcrest accounting department and arranged for Michael Orr to have a standing charge card at the lunch checkout counter. He'd done the same for several of the poorer black kids who had come to Briarcrest. In a couple of cases, he had, in effect, paid their tuition by giving money to a school fund earmarked for scholarships for those who couldn't afford tuition. It was my only connection to Michael, he said later. Lunch. Sean left it at lunch, and at lunch it might have ended, but a few weeks later, the Briarcrest Christian School took its Thanksgiving break. One cold and blustery morning, Sean and his wife, Leanne, were driving down one of the main boulevards of East Memphis, when, off a bus just ahead of them, steps this huge black kid. He was dressed in the same pair of cut-off jeans and t-shirt he always wore. Sean pointed him out to his wife and said, That's the kid I was telling you about. That's him, Big Mike. But he's wearing shorts, she said. Uh-huh, he always wears those. Sean, it's snowing. And so it was. At Leanne's insistence, they pulled over. Sean reintroduced himself to Michael and then introduced Michael to Leanne. Where are you going? He asked. To basketball practice, says Big Mike. Michael, you don't have basketball practice, says Sean. I know, says the boy. But they got heat there. Sean didn't understand that one. It's nice and warm in that gym, said the boy. As they drove off, Sean looked over and saw tears streaming down Leanne's face, and he thought, uh-oh, my wife's about to take over. The next day afternoon, Leanne left her business. She had her own interior decorating outfit, turned up at Briarcrest, picked up the kid, and took off with him. A few hours later, Sean's cell phone rang. He picked up and heard his wife's voice on the end of the line. Do you know how big a 58 long jacket is? She asked. How big? Not big enough. Leanne Tuohy had grown up with a firm set of beliefs about black people, but had shed them for another, and could not tell you exactly how it happened, other than to say that, I married a man who doesn't know his own color. Underline that sentence. That's incredibly important. So Leanne Toohey had grown up all the way to man who doesn't know his own color at the end of that quote. Her father, a United States Marshal based in Memphis, raised her to fear and loathe blacks as much as he did. Friends who saw Tommy Lee Jones in the movie U.S. Marshal would say to her, "Oh my God, that's your father." The moment the courts ordered the Memphis public school system integrated in 1973, he pulled her out of public school and put her into the newly founded Briarcrest Christian School, where she'd become a member of the first graduating class. "I was raised in a very racist household," she said. As her father walked her up the aisle so that she might wed Sean, he looked around the church, filled with Sean's black ex-teammates, and said, "Why are all these niggers here?" For the record, I hate that word, and if I hear any of you use it outside of this context, or even in this context, I'm going to freak out, so don't use that word. It's bad. I'm only reading it because it's in the book. Even as an adult, when she mentioned in passing that she was on her way into a black neighborhood on the west side of Memphis for some piece of business, he insisted on escorting her. And when he comes to get me, he shows up with this magnum strapped to his chest. Yet by the time Michael Orr arrived at Briarcrest, Leanne Toohey didn't see anything odd or even awkward in taking him in hand. This boy was new. He had no clothes. He had no warm place to stay over Thanksgiving break. For Lord's sake, he was walking to school in the snow in shorts when school was out of session, on the off chance he'd get into the gym and keep warm. Of course she took him out and bought him some clothes. It struck others as perhaps a bit aggressively philanthropic. For Leanne, clothing a child was what you did if you had the resources. Underline that sentence. It struck others as perhaps a bit aggressively philanthropic, too, if you had the resources. She had done this sort of thing before and would do it again. God gives people money to see how you're going to handle it, she said, and she intended to prove she knew how to handle it. For Leanne, the mystery began once Michael climbed into her gray minivan. He got in the car and didn't say anything, she said. Not one word. "Tell me everything I need to know about you," she said. She noticed his sneakers, all beat up and raggedy. "Who takes care of you?" He didn't answer. "I've noticed in the African-American community the grandmother often helps raise the kids. Do you have a grandmother?" He didn't, but he didn't explain. This wouldn't do. Leanne Toohey was an extreme and seemingly combustible mixture of tenderness and willfulness. She cried when a goldfish died. On her daily walks, when she spotted an earthworm sizzling on the sidewalk, she picked it up and put it back on the grass. On the other hand, when a large drunk man pushed and cut his way in front of her in a line outside a football game, she grabbed him by the arm and screamed, "You just get your fat ass right back where it belongs, now." When she did things like this, her husband would shrug and say, "You have to understand that my wife has the heart the size of a pea. If you cross her, she will step on your throat and take you out, and she won't feel a thing." Sean had decided, no matter what the potential gains, it was never worth provoking his wife. And while this child's reluctance to answer her questions had provoked her, we're gonna keep talking about this," she said. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. Take your pick." That worked, sort of. She learned that he'd not laid eyes on his father in many years. He never had much to do with his grandmother, who was now gone. He had a sister, but didn't know where she was. His mother was, Leanne surmised, an alcoholic. But he never actually used the word alcoholic. He let me say it and never corrected me. I didn't know then, but Michael will let you believe what you want to believe. After torturing him for a bit, she decided to leave him be. She'd had too much success getting what she wanted to pay attention to temporary setbacks. It was only a matter of time before he'd tell her everything. I knew that 103.5 FM was kind of a black station, so I had that playing, she said. I didn't want him thinking this was some charity thing, and oh, poor pitiful me. So I said that the Briarcrest basketball team needed its players looking spiffy, and we were just going out to make sure that happened. If it were up to her, she would have driven him straight to the Brooks Brothers or Ralph Lauren, but she realized it might make him uncomfortable. No offense, but where do you go to buy clothes? She asked. He mentioned a place. It was in a less affluent section of Memphis, not the safest neighborhood. She set off in that direction, heading west. You okay going there? He asked. I'm okay going there with you. You're going to take care of me, right? Right, he said. She sensed a little shift in him. Sooner or later, she'd break him. I can talk to a wall, she liked to say. For the next couple of hours, that's just what she did. She was facing a new problem, trying to guess from his body language what a 16-year-old black child of the ghetto might wear to his new white Christian school. They arrived at the first of many big and tall shops, and ran smack into another problem. Nothing fit him. He wasn't big or tall. He was big and tall. The selection of clothing into which he could painlessly squeeze himself was limited, and he reduced it by refusing to wear anything that wasn't loose-fitting. For 20 minutes or so, she pulled the biggest articles of clothing she could find off shelves and racks without comment from the boy. "Michael," she finally said, "you got to tell me if you like it or not. I cannot read your mind, or we'll be here till Christmas with me trying to guess what you like." She pulled down the absolute biggest shirt she could find. "I think that's okay," he said at length. For him, it counted as a soliloquy. "No, not okay. You need to love it. If you don't love it in the store, you'll never wear it once you get it home. The store is where you like it best." She pulled down a gargantuan brown and yellow rugby shirt. "I like that one," he said. She was 5'1", 115 pounds of blonde hair, straight white teeth, and the most perfect pink dress. He was black, poor, and 3 times her size. Everyone stared at them. And as they moved from shop to shop, the surroundings and the attention became more discomforting. At the final big and tall shop on the border of what had been just pronounced by the 2000 United States Census the third poorest zip code in the country, Leanne said, "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never been to this neighborhood." And Big Mike finally spoke up. "Don't worry," he said. "I got your back." Along the way, she asked him more questions. But of course they were the wrong questions, she said later. She noticed little things about him, however, and in these were tiny clues. "I could tell he wasn't used to being touched," she said. "The first time I tried to touch him, he just freezes up." When they were finished shopping, he was heaped with packages, and yet he insisted he wanted to take the bus home. "I am not letting him ride the bus with all these bags." She drove him back into what she assumed must be the worst neighborhood in Memphis. Excuse me. Where am I? They stopped in at McDonald's. He ordered for himself 2 quarter pounders with cheese. On a hunch, she bought 6 extra burgers for him to take with him. At length, they reached what he said was his mother's house. It was an ominous, dark red brick building with a tall metal gate. Across the street was an abandoned house. The scrub grass, the dead plants and pots, the flaking paint on the houses, everything, including the small children in the streets, looked uncared for. She parked and stepped out of the car to help him with all the bags. That's when he sprang into action. "Don't get out," he said. "I'll just help you with the bags. You don't need to get out of the car," he said. He was so insistent that she stepped back inside the car and promised to stay put, with the doors locked, while he went in and found someone to help him with his packages. A few minutes later, a line of small children streamed out of the front gates of the depressing apartment building and, ant-like, lifted the sacks and carried them inside. When the last child had moved the last package, the gate closed behind him. He hadn't given her the first clue of what he probably thought of her, or of their strange afternoon together. Probably, she figured, that I'm some nice lady who wanted something from him. So when he thanked her, she made a point of saying, "Michael, it was my pleasure. You don't owe me anything." And that, she thought, was that. But it wasn't, of course. He was different from the other children that she and Sean had helped out. For a start, he was obviously more destitute, and she couldn't explain why just then, but she was drawn to him and felt the urge to do things for him. He was just this big old kid who could have been mean and scary and thuggy, but everything about him was soft and gentle and sweet-natured. Underline that line. He was just this big old kid who could have been mean and scary all the way to gentle and sweet-natured. With him, she felt completely safe. Even if he wasn't saying anything, she sensed he was watching out for her. She went home and thought about the problem still at hand. How to clothe the biggest 16-year-old boy she'd ever laid eyes on. She flipped through her Rolodex. Several of her interior decorating clients were professional athletes. All but one were basketball players, and all of them were tall and thin. The other was Patrick Ramsey, the Washington Redskins' new starting quarterback. "I knew how these athletes are about their clothing," she said. "They're very particular, and they're tossing them out and getting new ones all the time." What more fertile source of extra-large hand-me-downs than the NFL? She called Ramsey, who said he was more than happy to dun his teammates for their old clothing. She gave him Michael's measurements, and Patrick Ramsey took him down. A few days later, he called back. "You've got these measurements wrong," he said matter-of-factly. She explained that she had taken out the measurements herself and written them down on a piece of paper. It must be Patrick who had them wrong. He read them back to her. 20-inch neck, 40-inch sleeve, 50-inch waist, 58-inch chest, etc. Nope, he had them right. "There's no one on our team as big as he is," Ramsey said. She thought he was kidding. "Leanne," said the Redskins quarterback, We only have but one player on this team who is even close. And he wears Wrangler blue jeans and flannel shirts, and no black kid is going to be caught dead wearing that stuff. That would be John Jansen, the Redskins starting right tackle. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Who is this kid? All right, that's the end of chapter 3. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk about it in class tomorrow, and I will have the video for the second half of the first half of chapter 4 up for tomorrow afternoon. Have an awesome, awesome day. Bye, guys.